Hi, all. First of all, let me start by apologizing for my inadvertent possible exposure to y'all. I know that emergency management has been sending out emails warning you, and again, I can't tell you how sorry I am. Um, I myself am fine. I don't have any major issues. My only symptoms so far have been the runny nose, which again I originally thought was allergies, and this morning I lost my sense of taste, which kind of sucks. I'm not gonna lie, but certainly it could be worse. So I'm grateful. Um, so what I want to do today is just kind of go over chapter 8, which we're supposed to go over tomorrow, but hence, obviously we'll make the best of the situation. So chapter 8 talks about kind of the development of India. Now, if you all recall, the last time we were talking about India, you essentially have, the Harappan civilization in the Indus River Valley established, again, obviously, as we've discussed already in the past, the actual civilization brings up far more questions than answers, but nonetheless, around 1500, you eventually see its eventual decline, probably because of environmental reasons. And it just coincides with the arrival of these Indo-European people, the Vedic peoples, who begin to fan out throughout northern India and establish these Mahajana Pandas. You all remember the tongue twister from the last exam. Now, these kingdoms turn into pretty large regional areas. Okay, and remember, keep in mind that the area of northern India itself is relatively it's pretty well populated even back then, and so these are pretty populous kingdoms. And I think that is pretty much where we kind of, I mean, obviously it's a very crash course kind of welcome you back to India, but we'll just kind of become acclimated as we go along. Now, um, one of the things I should probably mention before we actually get into this is the eventual arrival of Alexander the Great. Now, if you all recall, Alexander the Great, towards the end of his campaign, was chasing the Persian Shah and Xerxes through what is now Afghanistan, and upon catching up to him, because he had been murdered by his followers, the Shah did, Alexander continued into what is basically now the Indus River Valley, and you can actually see his route here pointed out here in the route here that he takes, where he crosses over the Khyber Pass and invades the area of the Indus River Valley. Now, at the time, you have some pretty large, again, Mahajana Pandas, these pretty large regional kingdoms developing, and Alexander is able to defeat them all and bring them under his control. Now, again, as we mentioned before, Alexander was planning to continue eastward to continue his conquest of northern India. However, facing a mutiny, and his soldiers refused to continue on. He eventually is forced to march back to Persia. But nonetheless, you do have you do have him leave behind, some minor generals pretty much in charge of this area here. So you do have these kind of Greek satrapies. Now, remember, just I should probably mention that. Remember, alongside maintaining the title of Shah, Alexander also maintains the Persian political structure. So if y'all remember the satrapies, these provinces within the Persian Empire, he basically keeps them, intact. And so, he just replaces the leadership and puts his own people in charge. So all of a sudden, these Persian satrapies in the Indus River Valley now become Greek satrapies. Now, nevertheless, Alexander's defeat of most of the military forces here, at least in northwest India, kind of creates a political vacuum. And in this vacuum, you have one particular ruler by the name of Chandragupta Maurya, who is able to kind of take advantage of the political situation and actually begin the process of essentially just the kind of not only conquering the surrounding Mahajana Pandas, but even actually conquering the Greek satrapies, essentially establishing a relatively large empire in northern India at this point in time. And I'll actually point it out here on the map here. Forgive me. Um, as you can see here, under the leadership of Chandragupta Maurya and later on his successor Ashoka, you have much of India itself, including parts of southern India, now under a single imperial rule. Um, and so, the interesting story about Chandragupta is that Chandragupta is again kind of this warrior conqueror, and able to kind of bring much of northern India to his control, and even goes toe to toe with the Seleucid emperor as well, and is able to win some stunning victories. But eventually, he eventually will convert to Jainism. Now, we'll talk about Jainism in just a bit, but what it basically refers to, or what it basically implies, is this idea of peace and nonviolence to an extreme, as well as I'll show you in just a bit. But nevertheless, upon his conversion to Jainism, he essentially abdicates. He leaves the throne and leads a life of being a wandering monk. And according to tradition, he actually, and as well, again, as we'll see later on, one of the major kind of requirements of a Jain is essentially the restriction of every type of material concept, even food. So it's not uncommon for devout Jains to actually dehydrate to death or starve to death. And in this case, according to tradition, Chandragupta Maurya was such a devout Jain that he actually starved himself to death. And so Chandragupta, again, as I mentioned before, essentially pretty much just abdicates and later on dies. Now he abdicates to his son Ashoka, who kind of continues his father's conquest of India, and he kind of culminates his conquest with the eventual invasion and conquest of Kalinga here. Kalinga is this region here along the coast of the eastern coast of India, and in this particular case was incredibly brutal. It is estimated that about at least 300,000 people died in the conquest of Kalinga. Now, the massive loss of life through this military campaign inspired Ashoka to essentially seek counsel with Buddhism. And again, we'll talk obviously about Buddhism later on. But nonetheless, Ashoka will eventually convert to Buddhism and essentially rule his empire through Buddhist principles. Now, we know the extent of his reign and his power through the erection of these pillars. Now, these pillars that you see here on the pillar you see here is an example of the pillars that were erected by Ashoka. Now, how this works, or what the process is that most these pillars were erected in different parts of his empire, and on the bottom here, you can actually kind of see it hollowed out. But at one point in time, it was either written in stone or it was put on a metal, kind of like a metal wrap around the inscriptions of his laws, his orders, his commands, etc., etc. So really, they not only served as a reminder of his power, but also as a, I guess, a symbol of the extent of his power. Now, if you notice here, just to kind of show you the example and the influence that Hellenism, the Hellenization, remember the flow or the spread of Greek culture and influence, etc., etc. The style of architecture, particularly the line itself, and this kind of design that you see here at the bottom, right below the line, is very Greek inspired. So it goes to show you just how far this is, where this pillar in southern India is constructed in this kind of Greek style of architecture. It's incredibly fascinating. Now, um, during his reign, uh, the Ashoka essentially attempted to kind of rule his people through the process of Buddhist principles and Buddhist concepts. And one of these is an example of ahimsa. Ahimsa in Buddhism and in Hindu principles as well, because as we'll see, Buddhism bases itself a lot on Hindu tradition, is nonviolence, the idea of nonviolence. And so you see again this emphasis on nonviolence, and you have the conquest ending, you have the empire kind of demilitarizing. It's a pretty extensive campaign, and again, the process of this was through the acquisition, or at least the attempt to acquire, what we call dharma. Now, this dharma itself is a again one of those things that the Buddhists, as we'll see, kind of borrowed from the Hindus, and it's essentially kind of the concept of cosmic law, social order. And so, again, the emphasis on this nonviolence was an attempt to essentially enforce what he considered to be the cosmic order of things. But nevertheless, right, in order to ensure this, you essentially have the enforcement of his commands and his laws through the creation of basically a security force, a security force designed to monitor the actions of his people. And so a massive security force was created within this empire to ensure that his people were following these principles that he laid out based on Buddhist teaching. Excuse me. Now, um, aside from, again, this kind of embracement of Buddhism, India at this point in time becomes kind of this center of commerce and trade, not just in its nearby surrounding areas, but the entire Indian Ocean basin. Now, remember, and I'm sorry I don't have a map, but if you all recall, the Indian Ocean basin encompasses everything from East Africa to Arabia to Persia. India, obviously, Southeast Asia, the Indonesian islands. All of these areas kind of fall in this sphere, and even to an extent, China and Japan also become involved in this as well. And India kind of serves as this center meeting ground where you have everything from East African merchants selling drafts to Chinese merchants selling paper and porcelain. And so you have them all being kind of conducting business here in India, which needless to say leads to a tremendous amount of economic prosperity. Now, despite the successes of Ashoka and the Mauryans in general, the dynasty itself is kind of built on shaky grounds. As I mentioned before, remember, keep in mind that this empire was established basically out of conquest. And whenever you have a situation like that, you're always going to have you're always going to see, and we'll see this as we go along, this very tedious grasp on territory. Now, eventually, um, you will see a conflict kind of arise with their northern neighbors, who we'll talk about in just a minute, the Kingdom of Bactria. And eventually, because of everything from certain instability to essentially this kind of war that breaks out that the Myrans are not prepared to fight, and eventually the Mauryan dynasty will eventually collapse into itself. So again, as I mentioned before, right, the Mauryan Empire collapses now. Rival. So essentially, what happens is that while there's an attempt to basically kind of keep the empire intact after the Mauryan's pass, eventually India falls into this tradition of basically breaking up into these small regional kingdoms as it has in the past. Now, the as I mentioned before, in the north, you essentially have this Greek-speaking kingdom established in what is now Pakistan, Afghanistan, and southern Kazakhstan, known as the Kingdom of Bactria. Now, it was originally part of the larger Seleucid Empire. If you'll recall, after Alexander's death, one of his major generals, Seleucus, is actually able to kind of carve out much of the old the Achaemenid dynasty for himself. That only lasted a brief period of time because in 256, just a few decades after the creation of the Seleucid Empire, one of the more minor generals essentially declares himself independent and creates a new kingdom based in what is now Afghanistan. And this kingdom of Bactria itself, as you can see here, lasts for a pretty significant amount of time, and it's actually pretty successful. Again, using a kind of Greek taking advantage of the Hellenization, the large number of the large amount of Hellenization in the region, you have the establishment of some pretty wealthy and impressive cities, particularly the city of Bactra and Bergram, which is actually still in existence to this day. These areas, because of their location, become incredibly wealthy. Now, it's something I mentioned earlier, but important to kind of reiterate is that. Central Asia in general, and the Kingdom of Bactria specifically, was actually a pretty prosperous region, right? Because of the location of its trade. Remember, this is the kind of where the heart of the Silk Road. If y'all remember, we were talking about this Silk Road, this massive trade network between East and West. And remember, there's no official road; it's just the name that we give to the various trade routes and roads and ocean, navigable routes that were taken between east and west, north and south, et cetera, and taking advantage of it, the kingdom of Bactria becomes incredibly prosperous. However, it eventually meets its end when it is overrun by a rival of nomadic invaders, the Yuezhi. Now, the Yuezhi are kind of a mysterious people. There's been more and more research done lately on the thesis, built on the thesis that the Yuezhi are actually the successors, or at least the descendants of the Indo-European peoples who arrived in what is now far western China. If y'all recall the mummies that we saw when we talked about China, they're kind of in that same route. But they had been living there for quite some time, but eventually they come into conflict with another rival nomadic group who eventually pushes them southward. All right, and these Weji arrive here and essentially kind of overrun the kingdom of Bactria. They kill and or eliminate the leadership of the kingdom of Bactria, the Greek-speaking kings of Bactria, and establish themselves in this. And eventually, the Yuezhi are able to kind of not only stabilize the kingdom of Bactria, but also actually expand on it. As you can see here on this map, this area you see here in green, or which even includes much of northern India, falls under the leadership of this new, what we call Kushan kingdom. All right, so again, it's an incredibly a large and powerful, and again, based on the kind of trade that develops in this period of time. The Kushans are known to have really good relationships with the nearby the Sassanid dynasty, the Parthians, even the Han dynasty in China, and even has contacts with the Romans. So it's a pretty successful economic power, and it uses that to its advantage to create this relatively large empire. Now, from what we could tell early on, the Yuezhi actually seem to have converted to Hinduism early on, but eventually you have it convert to Buddhism under the leadership of their king Kanishka. Kanishka converts to not only converts to Buddhism, but actually becomes a patron. In other words, he sponsors the creation of monasteries and temples, and he actually sponsors missionary works into China. So in many ways, China, which again still is in many ways predominantly Buddhist, actually gets this tradition because of Kanishka's sponsorship. It was Kanishka who paid for this expedition of missionaries to enter to China, eventually become successful in converting the general population into Buddhism. And we'll talk about that obviously when we actually get to China itself. Um, Now, as I mentioned before, the um, the 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 Indian political situation after the collapse of the Maurya dynasty obviously becomes a little bit more unstable for a brief period of time, actually for quite some time, for about the next 300 or so odd years. But eventually, in the in the fourth century, you actually see a resurrection of imperial power in India, and really where kind of it starts, or the origin of this is, well, is this its first king, Chandragupta the First. Now, Chandragupta the First, as I um, as I mentioned right now, is one of the kind of, is not necessarily the first king of this kind of Gupta empire, but he's probably the most successful. He kind of the Gupta people originally, as you can see here on this map, were a relatively small Mahajanapanda here along the Ganges River, but under the leadership of Gupta, the first of these great kings, they expand their territory, but it's really under the leadership of Chandragupta the First and Samandragupta, who really do begin kind of expanding to reach basically kind of the levels in many ways that the old Mauryan dynasty had. So over the next 60 years, Chandragupta and his son Samdragupta are able to kind of expand this large empire, as you see here, as we see it at this point in time. Now, the the Gupta Empire itself right? Again, much like its successor, based its kind of traditions and its kind of concepts on Hinduism. All right, so needless to say, you have the expansion, the promotion, and the patronage of Hinduism by the Guptas at this point in time. Now, this is important to note because, as we'll talk about when we talk about the religious situation in India, Hinduism at this point in time kind of uh, fallen behind in terms of this. Now, we have a lot to talk about, obviously, about religion in India because the last time we talked, Hinduism technically doesn't exist. But again, as we've discussed already, this Vedic religion will eventually morph itself into Hinduism through a long and steady process. But eventually, the popularity of Hinduism itself is threatened by the rise of the rise of Buddhism. Nevertheless, you have this kind of proliferation of Hinduism under leadership of the Guptas, right? And you even have the sponsorship of great writers and scholars and historians. For example, of this Kalidasa is kind of considered to be the Shakespeare of India, who kind of wrote these wonderful, beautiful poems and novels and even plays for that matter. So Kalidasa, under the patronage of the Gupta empires, kind of emphasizes this golden era of Indian literature at this point in time. Now, despite its original successes, it itself is also defeated by a group of nomadic invaders known as the Hunas, or the aka the White Huns. Now, interestingly enough, we call these the White Huns only to differentiate from the Huns. If y'all remember our old friends who raided the Roman Empire, or at least both Roman empires at this point in time, well, here's the thing is that it seems like the Huns themselves were actually kind of driven out of their homeland by the same people who drove out the Yuezhi. Now, we'll talk more about them a little bit in depth next time when we talk about China, the Zhongyu. But nonetheless, the Zhongyu essentially expanded their territory, kind of using terror and murder to kind of spread fear and force submission, and many of the nomadic peoples in Central Asia just simply left. And in this case, the White Huns, or the Huns in general, are an example of this. The White Huns are the ones who fled southward, eventually making their way to northern India, and eventually able to defeat the Guptas and basically cause a collapse. Their other cousins eventually made their way westward and eventually arrived in Rome. But so nonetheless, eventually you have two empires here severely crippled by the arrival of the Hunnish people, the Guptas and the Romans. Now, again, much like after the collapse of the Myrans, India once again falls into this kind of pattern of small regional kingdoms, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to emphasize, or I want to start talking about the southern kingdoms here of southern India. Now, if you notice, you go back to the slide where we were talking about the Myrans and now the Guptas. If you notice, the southern areas don't really fall under the influence of either dynasty. Right? They kind of are able to keep their independence, able to keep their kind of autonomy away from these kingdoms. And a lot of it has to do with the unification of their people. Now, needless to say, you do have small regional kingdoms like you see in other parts of India, but the Tamils, which make the majority ethnic group of southern India, are essentially very resistant to northern India's encroachments. Even the Vedic peoples really kind of avoided southern India when they first arrived. Nevertheless, despite their fierce independence, they nonetheless, like much of India, eventually adopted Hinduism. All right, so the Tamil people became devoutly Hindus and even remain Hindu, all right, even with the spread of Buddhism and eventually, as we'll see in the next couple of chapters, the arrival of Islam as well. Now, with this devotion to Hinduism, you again have these kind of Hindu kingdoms, these kind of theocratic kingdoms based on Hindu tradition and Hindu beliefs. For example, the Pallava kingdom here in the south, again under the leadership of Mahaderna Vikramavarman II. Mahaderna is the actual title, kind of like the Shahanshah or the emperor. Kingdom of Pallava, again a Hindu kingdom, which again maintains a lot of prominence because of its economic prosperity. Because of its location here in southern India, much of the trade routes via the ocean are kind of go through these regions, and so you see here this kind of these small but very economically wealthy kingdoms developing here in the southern part of India, and they use this wealth, as we discussed already, to patronize Hindu monasteries and Hindu missionaries, et cetera, et cetera. Now, despite the kind of unity of the Tamil people, they nonetheless have these regional struggles between the urban dwellers of the cities of southern India, and the kind of traditional areas of southern India. Now, southern India itself is primarily a tropical region, right? There's a lot of heavy rainforests and jungles in the region, and the forest people kind of have kind of prided themselves in being able to kind of survive and tame the jungles and kind of adapt to the difficulties there. And even then, further north here, you see a relatively dry desert, a hilly, kind of almost like El Paso in many ways, in the Chihuahuan Desert. But nonetheless, you have these regional differences which kind of cause a lot of differences of opinion when it comes to everything from economics to politics. Right? Now, oh, this is just a map of the kingdom of Pallava. As you can see here, it's a relatively large and prosperous kingdom here in southern India. Now, um, as I mentioned before, one of the things I want to talk about now is kind of the development of religious history in India at this point in time. If y'all recall, the last time we left off, the Vedic religion becomes the predominant religion, at least in northern India. However, it's problematic for many people. All right, even as early as 3,000. Well, I'm sorry, that's I'm thinking of something else. Even as early as, let's say, 700, 1000 BCE, you begin to see people having serious questions about the legitimacy and the validity of this religion. And remember, one of the big things is, first of all, India is changing. Now, if y'all recall, India still is under this traditional Varna system. Remember the castes, where you have the Brahmins, the priests, at the top, you have the warriors, et cetera, et cetera. But with the rise of this new economic system, you see new concepts, you see new classes that don't really fit this traditional mold. For example, this rise of the artisan class and the rise of the merchant class, all of a sudden now you have merchants and artisans who may be even as wealthy or even wealthier than the Brahmins, which again is not supposed to happen in this traditional Vedic religion. So all of a sudden now, many merchants and these artisans, these skilled craftsmen, are going, wait a second, why am I playing second fiddle to the Brahmins when, I actually have more land than the nearby Brahmin? Next are these wasteful rituals. Remember, Vedic religious rituals can last hours, days, weeks, and it's incredibly wasteful. Large amounts of animals are sacrificed. There are, they could take days, hours. It's really, 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 many people consider it to be incredibly frustrating, just simply because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. And finally, remember, in the Vedic religion, the only ones who can attain moksha, this oneness with the galaxy, the oneness with the universe, are the Brahmins. And so many people, especially those at the very bottom, are kind of left out in many ways. All of a sudden they're kind of shrugging their shoulders and going, well, what about us? So it's no surprise that, even early on, you begin to see people kind of breaking from this Vedic religion and looking for something more, uh, uh, you know, let's call it spiritual. Now, even in the early Vedic religion, it is not uncommon for people to kind of abandon their possessions, abandon their homes and their families, and eventually kind of uh, 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 lead these lives of hermits. And so these individuals are known as ascetics, or better known as hermits. These ascetics, again, live a very minimalist lifestyle. They often fast for days on end, and kind of wander around and kind of teach their own type of religious philosophy, but also try to attain some sort of enlightenment. Now, one of the individuals in question here that I'm going to emphasize is that of the Mahavira. Now, the Mahavira itself is actually a text that was used to essentially kind of, let's call it, it's actually two things. It's a text, but more importantly, it's a title, also known as the Great Hero, and also and this word is given to the leader, the founder of this religion, Nigahata Nataputa, all right, which is also known as the Jain. Now, just quick story. He, at the age of 30, he kind of leaves home and gives up all his worldly possessions. And after 12 years of just kind of wandering and just kind of trying to find answers, he eventually becomes enlightened. He finds the solution. He finds an answer to all of his issues. And uh, eventually he becomes this process of this concept of Jainism. Now, here's the thing: is that Jain doctrine emphasizes, Jain beliefs believes that everything possesses what is known as a jiva. A jiva is a soul. And when they say everything possesses a soul, they mean literally everything, everything around you. Your pencil, your cell phone, your desk, your if you're listening to this on your AirPods, they have souls. All right. And more importantly, the food that you eat and the clothes that you wear also have souls as well. And so in order to obtain a sense of balance with the universe, in other words, trying to maintain the sense of balance and sense of harmony, one must avoid upsetting the different jivas around you. And you do this through extreme ahimsa. Remember ahimsa, nonviolence? Ahimsa is the key to this. And what I mean by this is that, for example, Jains take this to an extreme. First of all, Jains, when they walk, will never walk with shoes on. All right, they always have to be barefooted. When they drink water, they have to filter it at least 5 different times to kind of take out all the souls. Obviously, they eat a vegetarian or at least a vegan diet because, again, needless to say, it's in. But even then, remember, starving oneself to death is one that is a pretty common occurrence in Jainism. So you have all of these very strict requirements. Even then, Jains, in the traditional sense, all right, do not often wear clothes. This is the statue of the Mahavira, the leader or the founder of Jainism, right? And as you can tell, he's clearly naked. But again, most Jains at this point in time are because, again, clothes oftentimes are an example of material possessions. All right, so when they say literal no literal materials exemptions or no material goods, this is exactly what they mean. Um, so you obviously you have a very strict religion, but nonetheless, it promises salvation. It promises salvation that if you are able to maintain your discipline, if you're able to avoid upsetting, the jiva and the kind of the universe around you, that you will obtain enlightenment and salvation. And so, despite its very strict requirements, you do see it becoming incredibly popular, especially in northern India. Now, despite kind of as eventually Jainism becomes more popular, you begin to see a debate developing among Jain scholars and monks about the issue of nakedness. So you begin to see what we call, this word is often used to describe religious splits between different religious testaments, and we'll see this a lot. You'll see a schism between Sunni Shia Muslims, between Roman and Greek Christians. These things tend to happen. Now, in this case, there is a schism between those who insist on complete nakedness and those who simply wear a white robe. Um, and so, essentially, you begin to see this kind of, let's call it a split between the Jains and the Jains who are completely naked and those who are not. But even then, it ties in more with the situation of how should you want to be. For example, there are people who cover, there are Jains who cover their faces in mat and in cotton to basically avoid breathing in souls. So again, you see the split between those who are like, yeah, we want to be minimalistic as much as possible. At the same time, we're not going to go nuts. And those who are like, no, you have to go completely naked and you have to really kind of take this to the extreme. Now, because Jains are not allowed to own possessions, most Jains survive by basically begging on the streets for food, or patronage, et cetera, et cetera. Now, eventually, because of this emphasis on nonviolence, they struggle to kind of find their way into the world. But even during the reign of the Mauryan and later on the Gupta dynasties, you have many of the political elites actually employing Jains as accountants, as ministers, bureaucrats within the government. Because again, there's no harm in writing stuff down. There's no harm in marking things, and so you see the many of the Jains essentially kind of getting or obtaining places within government, right, in order to kind of make a living. So again, it is not uncommon for a Jain to find employment within the governmental bureaucracy of these various imperial dynasties that develop in India at this point in time. Now, um, and so needless to say, as I mentioned just now, uh, it can be kind of overbearing to become a Jain. And so it's no surprise that about a century after Jainism is developed around the 700 BCE mark, you see another kind of middle path forming, one that isn't as, it does require a lot of sacrifice, but nowhere near as much as the Jains are. And so, needless to say, I'm referring to here as Buddhism. So, in order to talk about Buddhism, we should probably talk about its founder, Siddhartha Gautama, aka the Buddha. Now, according to tradition, Gautama was born in 563 BCE, and he's born to a very very wealthy nobleman, and his parents, upon his birth, swear to each other that their child will never ever know suffering. And we'll talk about what suffering means in just a bit, but nonetheless, just keep this in mind: no suffering whatsoever. And so, for 29 years, Siddhartha essentially kind of lives in this luxurious palace, closed off from the rest of the world. He marries, he has children, and he lives this life of privilege and pleasure that doesn't really. But nonetheless, he does eventually become curious about the world around him. And so eventually, in the middle of the night, he sneaks out of his palace for the first time and goes to the nearby village. And there he sees suffering. Now, when we talk about suffering, obviously the first thing that comes to mind is, people with a broken leg or people starving or people sick. Yes, that is suffering. But even then, you have things such as people becoming heartbroken because their husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever left them. You see people, becoming, including suffering because of, they can't afford the things that they want, not the things they need, the things they want. And so you see, so all of a sudden, all of this is new to him. All of a sudden, imagine being 29 years old and being exposed to all this. And so all of a sudden, it completely shatters his worldview. And so upon this, he returns back to his palace and basically leaves his family, and becomes a wandering ascetic, much kind of following the tradition of the Vedic hermits. He kind of wanders around. He fasts. He starves himself. There's one point in time, according to tradition, he almost starves himself to death. But nonetheless, nothing really helps. Now, eventually, according to tradition, uh, Gautama actually he wanders the Ganges River Valley and eventually finds a tree, a Bodhi tree. And he sits under it, and for 40 days and 40 nights, he meditates. And eventually, after the end of the 40th day, he comes to realization. He has discovered, or he has found enlightenment. He has found the answer to ending human suffering. And this was his goal the entire time. How do I end the suffering of man? And he's found it. And so spends the rest of his life essentially kind of leading or promoting this idea of a solution to enlightenment. Now, at the heart of this is the issue of, or at least the concept of, the Four Noble Truths. These are the things that everyone must understand in order, before you can actually attain enlightenment. And the first one is dukkha, which is life is suffering. Remember, it's not just breaking a leg or falling ill. It's again getting broken up with, or not being able to afford to buy the shoes that you want, or it's different things like this. All right, life is suffering. Number two, samudaya. All right, suffering arises from craving. In other words, remember, keep in mind that suffering arises from desire, from cravings, from desire for love, desire for food, desire for, again, the material world. Next, tanha. To stop suffering, one must stop craving. Okay, so again, you stop craving, all of a sudden suffering ceases. And number four, one stops craving by following the Noble Eightfold Path, which includes right views, right resolve, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So, pretty simple, yes? All right, it is. So, these are the Four Noble Truths: dukkha, samudaya, tanha, marga. Life is suffering, suffering arises from craving. To stop suffering, one must stop craving. And in order to stop craving, one must follow the Noble Eightfold Path. And so, aside from this concept, you essentially have this altruistic idea of respecting life of all beings and helping when you can, and it's a really positive universal message, right? One that transcends ethnic or linguistic lines, and this will become important later on. Now, according to the Buddha, once that is done, once you're able to understand the Four Noble Truths and you follow the Noble Eightfold Path, eventually you will be able to transcend this world of suffering and enter into what we call nirvana. This idea of, it actually means nothingness, but in reality, it actually means moksha, obtaining oneness with the universe. So nirvana is an old Sanskrit word that literally means nothingness, right? And it was used as a ancient Vedic term, but Buddhists adopt this term and kind of replace moksha with it. Remember, moksha in the Vedic tradition means, merging with the universe. Buddhists consider nirvana merging with the universe. And so the goal of every Buddhist is to obtain nirvana. Now, after the Buddha's death, you begin to see disputes about how the correct interpretations of his teachings or questions on how followers should conduct themselves. So it happens all the time. When a religious figure dies, his followers will eventually begin arguing among themselves about the true interpretations of his, just like we saw with Jesus, in a few centuries. This debate about it, and we'll see this with Muhammad as well later on. Now, eventually, over the next 200 or 300 years, you begin to see different factions of Buddhism forming, and eventually, the major traditional method of Buddhism becomes known as Theravada Buddhism, which Theravada literally means teachings of the elders. And so Theravada Buddhism becomes the predominant religion in India at a pretty quick pace. Remember, keep in mind that this is a religion that everyone can obtain. But here's the interesting thing about it is that the Buddha never really, tried to displace Hinduism. He saw this as kind of an addition to Hinduism rather than a complete religion. But we'll see this different. We'll see this kind of not be the case in many ways. Now, the kind of the biggest text of the Theravedic and even later other schools is the Pali Canon. The collection of the Pali Canon is essentially a collection of writings by these different early Buddhist monks, et cetera, and they kind of are the foundation of Theravedic and Buddhism in general. And so, as Theravada Buddhism becomes more, as kind of spreads out around its traditional homeland of Central India, it becomes more and more accessible. And so, again, more importantly, it emphasizes that this is a universal religion. Now, keep this word in mind, universal religion, because it is important. It is basically a religion that is open to everyone, right? Paul of Tarsus, back in Rome in a few centuries, will create a universal religion of Christianity. Remember, the religion that, or at least the movement that Jesus founded, it was very restrictive to Jews. Paul rejects the notion that this is simply a Jewish sect and kind of creates a universal religion. the Buddha, in this sense, oh, by the way, I should probably mention, I didn't mention, when he attains enlightenment, he stops being Siddhartha Gautama and becomes the Buddha. And the Buddha creates this, universal religion. Now, um, not only do you begin to see the written writings kind of spread throughout northern India and even southern India and eventually make their way to Central Asia, China. You even begin to see missionaries pop up in India and in Anatolia, Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. Not only that, but you also begin to see these teachers showing up. The word is a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is someone who actually has attained enlightenment, but does not proceed to nirvana because they want to help others relieve their suffering. So their goal is to teach others how to attain enlightenment. So the bodhisattvas kind of pop up and they show up as teachers, as helpers to help others obtain enlightenment as well. Now, eventually what happens is you begin to see again a split between the Theravedic traditional religion and this in a much let's call it less demanding. Uh, Theravedic Buddhists really, really, really kind of emphasize this whole, despite the fact that this isn't that traditional Buddhism is nowhere near as strict as Jainism it's still pretty strict. You still have these requirements to give away worldly possessions, and it's a very demanding religion. Over the course of time, however, you have some people who are become interested in Buddhism, but really are interested in the whole, giving away their possessions type of thing. And so this lighter, less friendlier version of Buddhism becomes very popular, especially excuse me, in East Asia, Mahayana Buddhism. All right, which again is more of a lighter kind of less demanding, and more importantly, it's also incredibly joyful. Theravedic Buddhists, research a lot. They read a lot of texts. They're really into their actual texts and research and scholarly work. Mahayana is much more, let's call it spiritual. But we'll obviously talk about that when we get to East Asia. Now, during the period from the Mauryans to the Guptas, you begin to see this Vedic tradition kind of changing for a couple of reasons. Now, eventually, the the popularity of Hinduism and later on, oh, I'm sorry, of Jainism and Buddhism, all of a sudden leave questions. All right, all of a sudden now the traditional kind of Vedic religion all of a sudden seems to be in decline. And so um, you begin to see kind of within itself the Vedic religion kind of altering some of its principles and to kind of, I guess, keep up with the traditional sense of the popularity of these other universal religions. Now, um, their goal really, so what you begin to see happening is this idea in Bharat, which is literally a which is literally actually a word for India today. The word Bharat often is used by local Indians to describe their country. But Bharat to this new movement is essentially this idea of a unified singular kingdom under this new Hindu belief system that is forming on at this point in time. And aside from that, you also begin to see, now remember, uh, Vedic religion has literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deities, and so you begin to see uh, 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 many Vedic peoples and others essentially emphasize three of the major deities at this point in time: Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Now, of the three, probably the most important ones are Vishnu and Shiva. Uh, Vishnu, the preserver of life, and Shiva, the destroyer of life, essentially kind of represent the goodness and evil of many. I wouldn't say it's dualistic, but nonetheless very important nonetheless. And so you begin to see many of these, and we'll call them now Hindus, right? Which again, remember, Hinduism, it's a very complicated word to emphasize, but this is a point in time where the Vedic religion begins to die out and this new Hindu religion takes its place. And so these Hindus kind of, while they worship other deities, these three, particularly Vishnu and Shiva, become incredibly important at this point in time. And so again, you begin to see the devotion of these two things, which are technically known as avatars. So the word avatar refers to an image or a deity. So you begin to see a lot of these avatars, particularly in the form of statues, being created for Vishnu, Shiva, and other deities as well. Now, so I want to skip Alvarez for now. We'll get to that later on, but I do want to begin talking about the economic situation because, like I said, there's a lot of stuff going on here in this part of the world in regard to the economics, economics and financial situation at this point in time. Now, um, the the concept of taxation all of a sudden sees a change. So remember, keep in mind that this is a point in time when in India, you see this increase in international trade, where all of a sudden merchants are coming from Africa, they're coming from Indonesia, they're coming from even China to conduct business in India. And so, needless to say, this is going to cause some problems that need to be reformed. Now, under the uh, under the Myrons, the tax system there was incredibly decentralized. In other words, local governors and rulers were responsible for collecting taxes and sending them to the capital. But even then, it's a very unstable situation. Now, the Myrons, for the most part, never, really kind of just, let's say, for example, did not really think this tax system through. And so because of the the centralization of decentralization of the tax system, it never really was able to kind of develop like it should have. And despite this, you do have the expansion of the Vaishya class, the Varna class, which now the, because of the ineffectiveness of the tax system, the Mauryan dynasty was always cash strapped. It was always looking for loans, et cetera, et cetera, which the merchant class were always happy to give. And so the Vaishya class itself found itself in an era of prominence because they became basically the bankers of the imperial system. Now, during the Gupta period, you essentially have a kind of change in system, a change in concept. Um, so essentially, what happens here at this period in time is that the taxes essentially were you begin to see the reformation of the tax system. So you essentially have one between one quarter and one third of the harvest essentially taxed under the leadership of the Guptas. So again, you have this tax system being established, also known as the Sreni, which again is the tax system basically on property. Now, the Guptas did charge taxes in importing goods, which obviously, as we in case you haven't taken 1301 yet, these are known as tariffs, and so these tariffs become kind of the standard process of taxation, especially for imported goods coming out of international port like Indonesia or Africa. Now the expansion of trade itself again is kind of one of the consequences, unintended consequences of this expanding imperial system, with empires rising from Rome to Persia to the Mauryans and the Guptas to China, and you see this continuous line of empires from one point of the Atlantic to the other side of Eurasia. You see this change in trade, where all of a sudden now merchants who were once afraid of getting lost or afraid of having bandits seize their goods, these empires are now not only allowing them to trade, they're protecting their trade. They build roads, they build lodges so the merchant can stay the night. They send their armies out to hunt down bandits and others. And so you do begin to see the stabilization of trade, right? Starting with Alexander's empire and continuing from that point on. Now, one of the kind of largest of these kind of centers of commerce in India at this point in time is the city of Tashila. Now, Tashila is here in northern India, and it becomes kind of the center point of commerce and trade. Its location, which is right next to the Khyber Pass. Remember, the Khyber Pass is one of the only ways to get beyond the Hindu Kush Mountains. Really does kind of serve as this kind of center of commerce. It becomes this incredibly wealthy area of commerce and business at this point in time. And again, much like every other imperial power, the Guptas had a consistent trade network with Rome. There were even some early scholars who proposed the idea that the collapse of the Romans and the collapse of the Guptas may have been linked, that one was so economically dependent on the other that one couldn't survive. But for what we know, that's not necessarily the case. But nonetheless, you do have this trade network developing between not just India and Rome, but India, East and West in general. Now, India's influence kind of surpasses and transcends, just as beyond its borders. You begin to see it having a direct influence in Southeast Asia. By about 100 CE, you begin to see dozens of small outposts, trading posts, settlements, forts that India's established in Southeast Asia. And needless to say, this is going to have a significant amount of influence, right, especially when it comes to religion. It is no coincidence that with the rise of international trade between India and Southeast Asia, you begin to see the proliferation of both Hinduism and Buddhism at this point in time. In addition, the southeastern kingdoms here, heavily influenced by the Hindu kingdoms of southern India, kind of basically copy, word for word, thing by thing, the wealth and opulence of the southern kings of India. Right, so the monarchies that were established here in Southeast Asia, right, take a significant amount of their influence, and even then, the Buddhist monarchies of again the other parts of Southeast Asia, which is now like Myanmar and Cambodia, they eventually convert to Buddhism, and they kind of adopt this concept of what are basically god kings, these individuals who, in it's kind of complicated to mention, but they're Buddhist, but at the same time they consider themselves to be representative of the Buddha here on earth. So, and then, even then, you have the adoption of Sanskrit as well. So Southeast Asia becomes heavily influenced by India as more and more trade is done during this period of time. Now, the the caste system, which we have discussed already at this point in time, it all of a sudden finds itself at a crossroads where new ideas, new businesses, new classes of people, all of a sudden find themselves left out of the traditional Varna system, and so the caste system, kind of showing resilience, adapts over time, where all of a sudden you begin to see it adapting and absorbing people of different languages, ethnicities, and religious practices into an integrated social whole. The caste system, even with the rise of Buddhism and Jainism, does not die away. As a matter of fact, Buddhists and Jains are incorporated into the caste system. So it's no longer just merely a religious, categorization process. It now is a way of life. It is now part of the culture there in India. And so, um, during the Mauryan era, you have this emphasis on dharma. Remember, Ashoka was really emphasizing emphasizing this issue of dharma, and all of a sudden now the issue of social position comes into play, and so all of a sudden now there is a question of, okay, well, what exactly does this mean? What exactly do we do now? Where all of a sudden now Brahmins are now being forced to conduct business with merchants. You know, now here's the thing: is that all of a sudden now there is a concern about ritual pollution. Remember, Brahmins, because of their position high here in society, are not supposed to really talk to anyone below. You can talk to the Kshatriyas, but anything below this is not really acceptable. But all of a sudden now, Brahmins are having to conduct business with merchants and with artisans, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have this question of ritual pollution. And so the caste system is all of a sudden now being required to adjust itself to ensure that Brahmins don't lose their position in societies because they have to conduct business with merchants. So you begin to see this kind of loosening of these restrictions. Remember, it used to be considered to be you could lose your place in society if you're caught talking to a lower person. But over time, you begin to see these loosened. They're not entirely lifted, but you do begin to see these restricted loosened. And like I said before, you have these new religious movements being incorporated into the system. Both Jains and Buddhists all of a sudden find themselves subject to these particular caste system. Uh, Now, the the issue of family life, is particularly the role of women, was perhaps was more complex than it is in other societies. Because remember, the idea of female dependence is central to the concept of Indian family. However, you still have them considered to be partners. So you do have this mix of this kind of patriarchal system, but with this sense of feminine importance, where females can own property, or family lines, especially in South India, are considered to be matrilineal. In other words, your descendants not doesn't necessarily come from your father's side; it comes from your mother's side. But nonetheless, you do have some kind of controversial issues that come up, particularly with the form of the sati. I might have talked about this before, but I just want to emphasize this. If you all recall, the sati is this traditional kind of symbol of love, where a widow, who is watching her husband's body being burned at a funeral pyre, throws herself onto the fire as a kind of symbolic symbol of their undying love. Um, this is a situation that is still occurring in India at this point in time and will continue on for quite some time. And it kind of shows you this kind of conflict between this clear indication of matrilineal lines and a clear example of hyper patriarchy, where you have women committing suicide on their husband's funeral pyre. Now, a number of texts in Jainism and Buddhism and now Hinduism describe really the four stages of men and the roles of men as they continue on. The first stage of a student is, that of study the works of the Upanishads, the Brahmanistic texts, et cetera, et cetera. They're supposed to study whatever religious text applies to them. Next, the householder, uh, establish a good marriage, create a prosperous household, and maintain his religious duty. His third stage, he's expected to retreat to the forest and work to master the self in the preparation for the end. And finally, the wanderer stage, he should move beyond the desire for life or death, wandering without home or possessions, ideally attaining moksha. So this is ideally, especially in southern India, the ideal for the four stages of life. Studying the ancient religious texts of the Brahmins, building and maintaining a household, raising a family, and creating prosperity, distancing yourself from your family and preparing yourself for an eventual end, and eventually wandering out and eventually trying to obtain moksha. Now, although women were, for the most part, treated as subservient members of a patriarchal society, they nonetheless, all of a sudden were seen by men as both as complementary opposites and also impediments to moksha. There are many who believe that the concept of sex is one that is actually a hindrance to your, your salvation. But nonetheless, sexuality, especially in Hinduism, becomes incredibly important and is celebrated. Because remember, keep in mind that even in the Vedic tradition, sex is seen as kind of the closest thing to the creation of the universe that you can get. And so Hinduism kind of picks up where that left off, and you see it kind of celebrated in Hindu art and in temples, and it's an incredibly, I guess what you would call, erotic form of artwork. Now, um, the probably the most famous example of this is the Kama Sutra. Um, the Kama Sutra was written sometime around the second century CE, and here in the West, it's basically known as a sex book. It shows various sexual positions, et cetera, et cetera. However, the majority of the text really doesn't deal with sex. It shows some illustrations, et cetera, et cetera, but it really kind of shows this concept of culture. For example, women, it describes details of cooking, singing, dancing, and even has things such as, chemistry, metallurgy, and even how to tame elephants. So while it is considered to be a sex book, and it does indeed show sex, it nonetheless does really emphasize this concept of daily life in many ways. Okay, so this is the conclusion of chapter 8. I will upload chapter 9 sometime, probably later on this week, and hopefully I will see you all next Tuesday. As with any other point in time in the class, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, please shoot me an email or a message on mine. I'm still available. I feel fine. Like I said, I'm just waiting to get a negative test so I can go back to work. But other than that, I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Thank you.